Welcome to Module 3.1, Introduction to Assessment. The overarching theme and purpose for assessment is to measure student progress as well as measure teaching effectiveness. So assessments to meet these goals needs to first be aligned with the student learning outcomes, connecting student learning outcomes to teaching and having assessment as a way of measuring progress towards student learning outcomes as well as teaching methods is critical. For online instructors, integrating assessment with the course design is fundamental, and in a slide or two I will introduce various ways to do that, including formative and summative elements, and then also being able to measure essentially using multi-methods and multiple approaches. You're measuring both lower order as well as higher order skills. Commonly, assessments are used at the end of a learning unit to measure the student's knowledge. Now, traditionally, and by traditionally I mean in face-to-face classes, we often employ what are referred to as high-stakes exams, midterms, major tests, and final exams, as well as major papers. Due to the limitations of student authentication, coupled with the strengths of assessment technology, assessment in distance ed environment flattens the assessment with frequent low-stakes exams and is more multi-method, combining multiple choice, essays, papers, collaborative projects, as well as discussions. And so the common use of weekly modular quizzes and discussions in avoidance of midterms and final exams is recommended. Now, coming back just for a moment to the notion of the limitations of student authentication, although of course in a face-to-face class you don't check student IDs regularly, I think the assumption, and it's probably pretty safe, is that someone who shows up to 50 plus hours of classroom time is probably the person who's registered for the class. But with an online class, it's much more difficult to track, in fact impossible to track a student's participation in the class. It would be easy for a classmate or a friend, a former graduate of the course, to take online quizzes or exams or write online papers and then submit them. And while this is easier but not risk-free with a face-to-face class, it's harder to prevent fraud and academic dishonesty with an online class. And so to decrease the likelihood that a student will find an individual who's more skilled to take the exam, or because face-to-face exams are given at a particular time and place, online exams are given over a period typically of a week. For a student who takes the exam early in the week and then tells other students or posts online the questions that are used in the exam for other students in the class to prepare, this needs to be mitigated, and it can be in a variety of ways. One of these is to break that high-stakes test into segments, and so rather than having a test over 4 chapters, for example, have 4 separate quizzes once a week. Another thing that can be done is to have exams be more reliant on writing, because you're in an online class, you're getting the writing samples every week when students post in the discussions, and it's easy then to track writing quality across the semester and across various assessment methods. Let's take a few minutes to compare the assessment methods of a face-to-face class with an online class. So in a face-to-face class, the exams tend to be more high stakes, so it's not uncommon for an instructor to have an in-class exam every 3, 4, even 5 weeks, and some even have just simply a midterm and a final exam. In contrast, an online course usually has modular exams, so they are more frequent. Every week there's an exam a student has to take, and they're not as lengthy or as important. So rather than having 50 or 100 multiple choice questions that you might find in an exam, a high stakes exam, you're maybe looking at 10 or 15 questions on a weekly exam. Another difference is that in face-to-face classes, students typically receive the same questions. So if you're giving an exam, you have 5 essay questions or 50 multiple choice questions, and everybody gets the same questions. And that has a tremendous benefit in terms of reliability, that you are comparing oranges with oranges. When the student gets a score of 75, you know the playing field was level for everybody. In contrast, online assessment typically draws questions from a pool of questions, and these questions are drawn randomly. Now, the reason for this is not simply because it can be done, because there are distinct disadvantages to doing this, but the advantage is that because online asynchronous courses don't administer a test at a particular moment in time, but rather over a period of a week, this can mitigate student fraud or student cheating. So students who early in the week see the essay questions, it's of no benefit to other students to get access to those questions because they knew those questions could be on the exam all along. And if the pool is large enough, that each student will be getting relatively different questions. So it goes a long way to decrease student cheating. Coming back to the face-to-face exams, these exams are typically closed book, and the great advantage here is that you're measuring student achievement based on knowledge and recall, and not simply or solely or primarily measuring a student's ability to find the material in the textbook or the notes. And so we think that face-to-face exams without the opportunity to look at notes or books is a more valid measure of a student's knowledge and understanding. One way to mitigate the disadvantage of not having the ability to enforce standards of no open book or open note access is to time your exams. So, for example, if you were to use the industry standard of 1 minute per question of a multiple choice exam, and you give 50 questions, give them 50 minutes, or 10 questions, give them 10 minutes. Now, this poses its own set of problems, and it solves some problems as well. One problem is that it does tend to level the playing field a little bit. Just as in a face-to-face class, you have 50 minutes to complete the 50 questions. Well, online you have 50 minutes to complete the 50 questions. Now, you can't stop a student from having a book in front of her as she's answering those questions, but if you don't provide more than a minute per question, and again, I'm talking about multiple choice questions, it's going to be very difficult for a student to hunt down the correct answer in a chapter, for example. The disadvantage, though, is that students, and this is the same disadvantage you have with face-to-face students, is students are variable in how quickly they answer questions. And so some students may need to take more time. Some students have accommodations that obligate the instructor to provide more time. So if you have a time and a half for a student face-to-face class, you can have that student take the exam at the LRC, the testing center. For an online student, what you can do is simply in Canvas extend the time, and that's an easy process to do. So that is a trade-off. With a face-to-face class, there's few authentication risks. You probably know who's taking the test. Maybe a little harder with a paper that's due. Someone else may have written the paper. That's why it's always helpful to have in-class writing assignments. But with an online class, that's even more difficult to assure authentication. And it's so important, especially with student fraud of student loans, that students sometimes are not are the ones who are accepting student loans to take a class, and they don't really participate in the class. So the authentication rules require that we take steps in our course design to minimize student fraud. And one of the ways that we do that is following these standards: have fewer high-stakes exams, have more writing required for the class, and include discussions as part of your grade, because that way students have to participate in order to get scores, and you can monitor their participation over time for writing differences that occur. And that's one of the advantages for an online assessment, is that you can include the frequency and, more importantly, the quality of student contributions, and that's far more difficult in a face-to-face class, where student or faculty typically do not grade people for their participation and nor their quality of their participation. As you're creating your class design, and in particular the assessment methods, I would encourage you to think of two types of assessments. And you might be surprised that you have already thought of these, but may not have labeled them as formative and summative. So formative assessment is kind of assessing the process, where you have frequent tests, frequent quizzes, frequent discussions, and they're graded. And you have a rubric that orients the student to how you're grading, and then you have the completed rubric that gives feedback to the student on their performance. So this allows you to modify your teaching, allows students to modify their study methods as they make progress through the course. And probably the most common summative or formative assessment method is to have discussion posts that are weekly, and you get feedback. And then, of course, if you have a flatter assessment and have weekly quizzes, that would be a formative assessment as well. Summative assessment, in contrast, is usually designed to measure what students have learned, and oftentimes is integral to the grading scheme. And so, again, thinking back on the typical ways of assessing students with major exams and papers, these oftentimes are meant to measure achievement to a particular point, but unlike the formative assessment, these points are fewer and farther between. So rather than weekly assessments, you may have 2 exams and a final, where you're testing a student's achievement every 5 weeks. Striking a balance between formative and summative evaluation, of course, would be a preferred way of assessing student progress and student achievement. One label you can give to this, to including both formative and summative, is to call it integrative assessment. In fact, that's what it's called. And integrative assessment uses both. You have frequent, especially as an online class, you have frequent small assessments, and that would typically be say brief writing opportunities, discussion forums, brief quizzes, whether they're multiple choice or essay. And then at the same time, having more summative tests and assessments, where you have a more important but less high stakes exam. So for example, you might have 10 points for quizzes along the way, and then maybe midway through the semester have a 30 or 40 point, a little bit more comprehensive. They cut across a number of dimensions or a number of weeks. And so at the end of the semester, you have less important a summative assessment and more important formative assessment in terms of contributing to the grade. And we would call this sort of continuous integrative assessment. So when incorporating integrative assessments into your course design, you're shifting from the evaluation of knowledge through a few testing events to measuring student learning frequently. As a result, the assessment isn't linked to a particular grade or single grade due to a performance in a midterm or final, but rather seen as more integral to the course design. And it provides great advantages. It allows the instructor to adjust their teaching, but maybe more importantly, I think it's a better measure of student learning outcomes. After all, a single test may be affected by a number of things, some of which you're not intending to test. For example, you're hoping to test, or you intend to test, the student's knowledge of the first 4 chapters in their reading, and to some degree their score will measure that, but also there's a fair amount of error to the measure. The student may be tired that day. They may have had some personal experiences that have stressed them out, made them anxious, interfered with their ability to study. And that can happen, of course, to any student for any test. But if you have just 2 or 3 tests over the course of a semester, the likelihood of any given student having some error added to their test result increases. In addition to that, I think having the multi-method of a variety of tests all contributing to the outcome and to the grade is beneficial as well, because some students are really good at writing, and so their essay exam scores are inflated, not because they know more, but because they write better. Other students are better at multiple choice because they seem to have that kind of ability to use logic, and they're test smart, and so those students have inflated scores because they're test wise coupled with their knowledge, and a student who may have equal knowledge isn't as test wise with taking multiple choice exams and thus has a lower score. So I think when we take this multi-method approach of multiple choice questions, essay questions, papers, writing assignments, all of that's beneficial. And one other thing I would add to this is that another benefit of having mixed methods is that grading essays and grading writing is especially challenging. And I think sometimes we instructors miss the mark when we think that simply because we know the material, we know how to grade essays. And there's really quite a science to it, as any English instructor knows who grades portfolio or uses a systematic way of assessing writing quality, is that there's a lot of error in grading essays. It becomes unfortunately too subjective, and so having rubrics, which will be a topic for a later module, but also having a mix of assessment methods that are writing required, but also that require other kinds of performance, whether it's an audio, a video, a portfolio, of a variety of things, including multiple choice questions which aren't graded by the instructor, can all add some validity to your assessment methods. Finally, at the risk of repeating myself, this slide highlights the importance and the way to provide integrated assessment. Essentially, the instructor is evaluating differently than he or she would on a face-to-face class. Less frequently, face-to-face, more frequently online, multiple methods, and timely feedback, which again I'll look at and present later on, where it's critical that students get timely, roughly about a week, and feedback is that you're giving something beyond just simply a score to students' progress, both on exams and discussion forums. So the bottom line is, as you're moving from being familiar with teaching face-to-face and moving to an online environment, please consider shifting from major high-stakes exams to weekly assessments, emphasizing reading or writing and emphasizing applied knowledge. Use short quizzes with an emphasis on application of concepts. So in other words, a lot of times multiple choice exam questions can be understood as requiring simply memory or understanding the concept, or being able to understand the concept sufficiently to apply the concept appropriately. Generally speaking, it's a little more higher order if we have applied questions than if we have simply descriptive questions that require memorization. So modifying the kinds of questions can be really helpful. And then finally adding discussions with an emphasis on analysis and real-world applications. So not asking students to summarize the first chapter or summarize what this topic means to you or what you've learned about this topic. You need to go beyond that. And so de-emphasizing summaries and emphasizing reaction to the information, because when a student reacts or provides an analysis, of course they have to, a precondition is that they know what they're talking about, that that there's an implied understanding. They can summarize and then take it a step further and provide some criticism of what they're reading. And so discussion forums emphasize the analysis and the application. So typically, and that works quite well in some courses, discussion forums will ask students to apply this topic or this prompt to their experience or to their day-to-day lives. Okay. In addition, having projects and papers with formative feedback rather than solely a score. English composition instructors do this. They get papers and then they provide feedback, they have peer feedback, and then students go back and write a second and a third and a fourth revision. And of course that's the way to do it. That's how you end with a higher quality paper. But unfortunately, and myself included, many of us instructors simply have students write a paper, and we take the final product. Give me a term paper. I get it at the end of the semester. I may or may not use a scoring rubric, and the student gets a score at the end of the semester, not getting an opportunity to make some mid-course corrections. And as all of you know, because you've had papers that have been processed formatively, where you've given it to your thesis advisor, for example, or professor, who gives you back your draft, and says, here, this is the feedback, make some corrections. Which brings me to the last point, is the importance and the potential for an online instructor to provide feedback to all assessment. Now, in multiple choice quizzes, they can generate their own answers, and you can set it up so that a student will get the correct answer upon submission. Of course, that's primarily beneficial if you're going to have just one administration of the quiz per week, and that you have a relatively large pool, so a student isn't going to take the test again and isn't going to be able to provide answers to somebody else, because the likelihood of those answers and questions being in the next randomly generated quiz is remote. So, but in addition to that, if you have the opportunity to provide greater feedback, not just, hey, this is the right answer, which is done automatically, but this is the right answer and why, or this is the wrong answer and this is why as well. So providing feedback is important, and you can do it with immediate feedback. What I've done in the past, if I have 3 quizzes, they can take it 3 times. I don't provide immediate feedback. I provide feedback after the deadline passes. So come Monday morning, you go to your quiz and you'll see what I was looking for as far as answers go. Now, with discussion forums and writing assignments, essay answers and papers, good teaching, of course, requires timely feedback, and timely, again, is roughly about a week, probably a little faster than we typically do in a face-to-face classes, but maybe more important is that students know when to expect the paper back. And of course that can be important in a face-to-face class, but it's doubly important online because students aren't seeing you, and it's not easy for them to always ask you questions. And so informing students that you will return the students' essay answers or their exam or their paper on a given day or by a given day is really helpful, and I found that to be not too hard to do. Occasionally I'll miss that deadline, in which I send another message saying, sorry, I'm missing the deadline, but it will be done 2 days later. And Canvas provides the scoring rubrics that you provide not only before the students take the exam, but then you use that to grade the exam. And when a student goes to the grade book and looks at her test scores or paper scores, not only does she find the score, but she clicks an icon and up pops the scored rubric with your feedback, both points per each criterion, as well as any written comments that you want to add. Okay, finally, Module 3.1, this focus on assessment. is largely having to do with course design. And so I'm the person to contact regarding the use of assessment as far as course design goes. But there's also another person you can contact, and that would be Reno, especially if you're more interested in the tools of Canvas and the technology rather than emphasis on the pedagogy.